This is a man who's made and lost several billion-dollar fortunes. And whenever there's that amount of money involved, there's almost certainly a great story about risk-taking, entrepreneurialism, and obviously characters get attracted to the money man. When he was growing up, he had a pseudonym. His name was Yasumoto. That's the Japanese name. And he was living undercover. He wanted to be accepted in Japan. He couldn't because he was Korean. And the crucial moment is that he decided when he was 15, 16 to go to America to learn English and forge a new chapter out of Japan. And that's a sort of liberation day.
Masa is one of the greatest, certainly one of the most consequential investors of all time. Why do you think he's so misunderstood when it comes to like the Silicon Valley elite?
Lionel Barber is a globally influential journalist. He's the former editor of the Financial Times who has reported directly from the Kremlin and the West Wing. Lionel led the FT for 14 years and steered it into the digital age. Today, we talked to Lionel about his new book, Gambling Man, which is a deep dive into the career of SoftBank's Masayoshi Son. Son-san, as we call him here in Japan, is closely watched by so many of our founders and investors, not just for his moonshot bets, but because of the strong signal they send about where he sees opportunity and how he thinks about Japan's future. One massive recent bet we discussed was the $100 billion AI joint venture, Project Stargate. I'm Tiffany Kayo, investor at Coral Capital. My DMs are always open on X or LinkedIn at Tiffany Kayo. Okay, let's get into it. Lionel, welcome to the Coral Capital podcast. We're super excited to have you on.
Great to be here, Tiffany.
So we've obviously read your new book, Gambling Man. It's extremely well written, I think, especially for a guy like Masayoshi Son, I feel like his life as well as his business is so complex, but you've wrapped like that entire journey and his journey like going into the future so far so well. So I just want to start off by saying that, yeah, I really, really enjoyed reading the book.
Thank you so much. That means a lot, Tiffany.
So I guess first question for you is you are a very well-known journalist. You've spoken with a lot of leaders, including Trump, Obama, Putin, the list goes on. What was it about Masa that made you want to write a book about him? Because you obviously had a lot of options. Why him?
The answer in one word is money. Not because I thought I'd be a millionaire, but because this is a man who's made and lost several billion-dollar fortunes. And whenever there's that amount of money involved, there's almost certainly a great story, a personal story about risk-taking, entrepreneurialism. And there are obviously characters who get attracted to the money man. But the other broader point is that Masa's story tracks what has happened to the global economy over the last 40 years and the impact of technology from the microchip to the internet to mobile and now artificial intelligence. So I thought I could use Masa's story to tell a bigger story. And then just finally, and I'm sure we'll get into this, Tiffany, there's a great personal story about being Korean Japanese in Japan and being an outsider and what that means. And I very much enjoyed, it was challenging, but telling that difficult story.
Do you think that the fact that Nikkei acquired the FT had some influence on the fact that the person that you chose to write a story about was, from Japan?
It's true that because the Nikkei bought the FT in 2015, and I made 14 trips to Japan as a result to build the relationship with Nikkei, and particularly the proprietor Kita-san and now Okada-san, that I had an unparalleled opportunity to get to know more about Japanese culture and business. But that wasn't the direct reason for doing it. This was more about what Tiffany was referring to, which is the gripping personal story of Masayoshi Son.
Let's start from the beginning then of Masa's background and upbringing. He was a Zainichi Korean. His dad had all sorts of different jobs, including a Pachinko business, as well as, he was a bootlegger, pig breeder. I think he had some issues with loan sharks. And interestingly enough, the name of the book is Gambling Man, which kind of ties into his upbringing and I think the challenges that he faced there. How do you think that background and his identity as a Zainichi Korean shaped who he is and how he did business in the future?
You got to remember, Tiffany, that when he was growing up, he had a pseudonym, an alias. His name was Yasumoto. That's the Japanese name. And he was, in a sense, living undercover. And that was a very difficult personal challenge for him. He wanted to be accepted in Japan. He wanted to be a public school teacher or then run a training school in education. And he couldn't do that because he was Korean. Remember, his grandparents came to Japan from Korea at the turn of the century. They were economic migrants. And the father, as you say, born in 1936, went through the war. They went back to Korea after the war for a few months and then came back to Japan and lived in a shanty town. So this was very, very difficult. And the father sacrificed everything for his family. Masa was child number 2, son number 2. And I think, those first few years were very difficult, but then things got better. The Japanese economy started growing, the post-war recovery, the industrial miracle. And actually, the family was quite well off, but he was never accepted. He was having to live undercover. And the crucial moment, and I think this explains so much, is that he decided when he was 15, 16 to go to America to learn English and forge a new chapter out of Japan. And that's a sort of liberation day.
Can I be cynical for a second? I kind of
Why not?
I kind of question. So I actually have relatives who are Zainichi Korean. So, obviously did not experience that firsthand, but have heard stories about, what it was like back then. And it was very difficult. So I'm sure he didn't have it easy. With that being said, I know, his dad was one of the first people in the town to own a car. He was traveling abroad in his early teens. By the time he was 16, he was living in the US to study English. To me, a part of me is did he really have it? I'm sure he
Yeah.
had it hard. How hard was it really? And I feel like he has this great personality of being a chameleon and a charismatic storyteller. How much of that is kind of tying into the background there?
Oh, he's a great storyteller and he exaggerates. But there is no question that for the first 3 or 4 years, things were tough. He didn't actually, by the way, grow up inside the shanty town.
Yeah.
He was on the outskirts. So it was the grandparents actually lived in the shanty town, in this shack. And as you say, he was born in 1957. By the early 60s, this family, the Son family, is doing pretty well. And his father is the Pachinko king in Kyushu. He's a millionaire. He's got lots of money, and so have the relatives. And they did have foreign cars, but they were confined to one segment of the economy. Masa didn't go to the University of Tokyo. He didn't go and join an investment bank or the central bank or anything like that. He couldn't do that. So that's why he went to Japan. So I agree with you. It's not dirt poor for that long, but there's still significant obstacles to him making his fortune.
Do you think that Masa sees himself as more Japanese or Korean? So, speaking on a personal level, so I grew up in Japan, but obviously my face is not Asian, and so my experience is very different. So it's complicated when people ask, where are you from or which country do you identify with? But in Masa's case, obviously his face is Asian, his passport's Japanese. For all intents and purposes, he's essentially Japanese. But what do you think he sees himself as?
Well, it's a great question because if you think about his name, Masayoshi is Japanese and
Right.
Son is Korean. He kept his Korean name even though he took Japanese citizenship and effectively naturalized. So he had the best of both worlds. Now he claims to be the first one ever to have done that, and that's not actually true, as I put in the book, but he wanted to be both. He didn't want to completely disown his Korean heritage, but it's important to remember that he didn't actually speak Korean. He'd only went to Korea for the first time in his early teens with his grandmother. So he really wanted to be Japanese. And I don't accept, as one or two Japanese business people who've said to me, that he doesn't like Japan, he's an outsider. I don't buy that. I think actually sometimes Masa is almost more Japanese than the Japanese because he wants to be seen as the most successful businessman, the richest person. He's actually not. He vies with the founder of Uniqlo, Tadashi Yanai. But he does, I think he is a patriot, and I think he cares about Japan and its place in the world.
Was there things from the conversations you had with him that made you think that way? Because I think the perspective that especially a lot of people in Japan have is like he's this great like leader that represents, I think, Japan, especially in the tech kind of sphere. But he's also super international. He's also very much a hustler that is quite different from Japanese people's typical characteristics. You know, he does business in the US, he does business and investments in China. And I think that also plays into this like, okay, is he really, I guess, building or fighting for Japan? Or is he really just an international man that's kind of building this tech legacy for himself?
Well, he's certainly a global capitalist. And as you rightly say, yes, he went back to Japan, by the way, and that was difficult setting up his own business. He couldn't get a credit line for a while from a bank, but he went into the software distribution business and eventually succeeded. But when the Japan economy crashed, the bubble burst, he went back to America and started building businesses there. And then he went into China with his Alibaba investment and taking advantage of the internet. And then he goes into India. He's investing in Indian businesses. I mean, and then he's raising money in the Gulf. I mean, this is a true global capitalist, the man who's benefited from borderless finance. And, you know, you could make the point that some people have is if he cares so much about Japan, how come he hasn't invested in more Japanese companies? He's been a venture capitalist. He's formed ventures. He's formed alliances to raise money for venture in Japan. But the record is pretty sparse. Now, I think that's partly true, but it's also true that Japan has not been very good at spawning a kind of Silicon Valley VC venture capital setup. So he's seen better opportunities, particularly in America.
So I have this theory or observation, I should say, that American billionaires, when they conquer the US or conquer the world, they tend to want to go to space. Whereas Japanese billionaires, it seems like when they conquer Japan, they want to go to America. Is that consistent with Masa's story?
I think Masa is much more interested in earthly matters and making lots of money on the ground. I don't think he has any ambitions to go into outer space. I don't think he's interested in colonizing Mars. I think he sees enormous opportunities, particularly in the American economy, on artificial intelligence. And that's why he's formed the partnership with Sam Altman of OpenAI and Larry Ellison, Project Stargate, where he's promised rather outlandishly to raise $500 billion for AI infrastructure, as he calls it. That's data centers and probably chips as well over the next 4 years. I don't think he'll get to that figure, but I think he's making a serious play in the area of artificial general intelligence. And that's what he's been talking about for 25 years.
I remember in the book when he asked him what you wanted him to be remembered for, he said AGI, which is, I mean, timely. And I know it's, you know, a big part of his legacy and like what he's been doing so far, but it also wasn't the first thing that would come to mind, I guess. What's your take on that?
Well, I think he now talks about artificial superintelligence. He's moved beyond AGI. No, I think he realizes that he had an opportunity to get into this field in a big way in the late teens, but of course he'd raised this $100 billion SoftBank Vision Fund, and he slightly missed the boat. He also famously did own about almost 5% of NVIDIA, which is the most valuable company in the world producing these super chips, and he sold the stake. So that was a bit of a mistake. He did very well on Alibaba, but that was one trade with NVIDIA that he did get wrong.
Right. Going back to, I guess, his track record as an investor, I guess just to start, do you think he's a good investor or not?
Yeah, look, you have to say that if you look at the record, starting with Yahoo, where he wasn't the first big investor, but he came on the back of Sequoia in 1995, 1996. That financed a whole load of investments in the late 90s during the dot-com bubble. Hugely successful. He got to owning more than 35% of Yahoo, and also he built a franchise, Yahoo Japan, which is still going, very successful. Then he invested in Alibaba, which is probably his greatest trade. He turned, 100 million, first 20 million, then 80 million, and then, it was well over 100 billion, that stake, when Alibaba went public. So that was a great one. But I would also mention ARM, which many people said, why is he ARM, which is the advanced chip designer based in England, in Cambridge, England, and also in Silicon Valley. He paid $32 billion cash. That's worth 140 billion or so now. And it's at the center of his plans on AI. But last point, I think it's really important to see Masa not just as an investor, but also as a builder of businesses. I mean, he did build a mobile phone operator from next to nothing.
Yep.
He bought Vodafone Japan. He turned it into SoftBank Mobile. He bought Japan Telecom. So he can operate business. And then he also bought Sprint. And everybody said that was a disaster. But actually, when it merged with T-Mobile, I mean, he created a third force in US telecoms. But obviously, we all know about WeWork, which was, to use a technical term, a bloody disaster.
So, I mean, I would argue that Masa is one of the greatest, certainly one of the most consequential investors of all time. Yahoo, as you said, in 1996, Alibaba in 2000, Vodafone Japan in 2006, iPhone in 2008, ARM in 2016, now OpenAI. This guy just seems to be at the right place at the right time. And in spite of, the tragedies like WeWork, still, I mean, some of the most important transitions in Japan and the world have happened because of Masa. Why do you think he's so misunderstood when it comes to like the Silicon Valley elite?
Well, some would say he's not misunderstood and that he threw so much money around in Silicon Valley with his SoftBank Vision Fund that he distorted valuations. There was a lot of waste of money. It wasn't actually venture capital anyway. He poured money into WeWork. But it's essentially, he's a disruptor and he broke up their party. He took on the VC firms in Silicon Valley. So obviously, they're not very happy with him. He's an outsider coming in. The other thing is obviously he's a big talker. I mean, he talks a very big game and he exaggerates. Modesty is not some word that you would necessarily associate with him, although in private, actually, he's a lot more, shall we say, he can be circumspect. He's not the big boasting, big mouth. And he's quite private as well. He doesn't talk about his family. He doesn't talk about, where he lives. All this is very low key. But he's made some enemies by just he's with his big mouth and making lots of promises and sometimes not always delivering.
With the SoftBank Vision Fund, it wasn't even structured as a typical venture fund with the 220 kind of format, right? Do you think that's also forced or perhaps inspired some of the funds and kind of the landscape that we're seeing in VC today? Because I feel like larger checks. Perhaps it's the timing with AI as well, but these larger kind of whale funds and these larger checks that are going into fairly early stage companies, I feel like kind of resemble what Masa is doing, and I guess continuing to do.
Yeah, this whole model of somehow turbocharging valuations as well as growth by
Yeah.
force feeding them with huge amounts of money. And by the way, these are not startups. What he was investing in were, not mature companies, but companies that say like Uber, 3, 4, 5 years old. Same with WeWork. WeWork, he didn't invest in right at the beginning. So it's the notion that, with some capital, you can then turbocharge the valuation. The other point about the fund, as you rightly say, is that it was leveraged. I mean, he was having to pay. He raised all the money from the Gulf. He got $45 billion, not, by the way, in 45 minutes. It took a lot longer to get the money out of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia than 45 minutes. But he did raise that amount of money, and $15 billion from the UAE, and that was 60 billion out of 98 billion. But he was also having to pay a 7% coupon, and he promised to, very handsome returns. So this thing was actually leveraged and under pressure to perform. And I think there came a point in the late teens, early 20s, where this was a bit mad. I mean, there was money going out at a rapid rate. He was seeing entrepreneurs coming in for 15 minutes, half an hour. There wasn't enough due diligence on the companies that he was investing in. He almost had too much money. Now, is that a model that's being copied? It's certainly being maybe refined, but some of the principles, yes, have been adopted.
Mm. Do you think Masa has made any changes or in the future will make any changes to the way that he invests? I mean, it doesn't seem like it looking at the Stargate AI project, but has he shared any learnings with you on the investment side?
Well, look, he's 67 years old. He's going to be 68 in August. And most people don't do a flip at that age when it comes to behavior. I think he certainly, after the latest sort of, well, he was slightly humiliated after the Vision Fund, and then there was the COVID impact. He lost a lot of money on trading with his in-house hedge fund called North Star, and I describe that in detail in the book. It's pretty hair-raising stuff. And I think after that, as we know, and it's, by the way, not the first time he's done this, he suddenly withdraws from the public limelight. There's a great phase of contrition. He says, I need to study. And some of it's true, but actually it's just a way of retreating, a bit like in The Art of War with Sun Tzu, of, actually he's plotting his comeback. And I don't think he is basically going to change how he behaves because he thinks he's been basically right. I mean, famously, when the stock market crashed in 2000, within a few weeks, he was saying, now is the time to buy. Stocks are cheap. And the general direction of technology in investing, it's all going to be good. The valuations will come back. They're real businesses. And he thinks the same now. He's a super optimist. And so I don't think he really will change. Masa is Masa, and SoftBank without Masa is not really SoftBank.
How long do you think he has been plotting something like Stargate? I mean, shoring up that much capital that quickly is obviously very difficult, but Masa time and time again seems to find capital from somewhere. I mean, how does he pull it off, and how long do you think he's been planning Stargate?
Oh, I think he's been planning something like Stargate for at least 2.5, maybe 3 years minimum, very much in deepest secrecy. But he had a plan to come back when he withdrew from the public stage. And he got very excited when he first saw ChatGPT. And he really decided, I've got to get close to Sam Altman. He knew him a bit. And he went about cultivating that relationship and took advantage of the sort of distancing between Microsoft, which was a very serious investor in OpenAI, and Sam Altman, and just kind of barged through the door. So he was just looking for the right person, the right moment, and the right vehicle for a big investment in artificial intelligence. No question. So it's been planned. This is not a spontaneous act. And I've said this to a lot of people who have skepticism about Masa. Actually, he is a plotter. He does do some. He can be incredibly intuitive and impulsive. And he'll look at someone like Adam Newman of WeWork and say, I'm giving you money. I'm going to, stuff you with money, billions. But on something like Stargate, this is very deeply planned.
I think it was described in the book as something along the lines of him saying, like, if you can envision it, then it must be true. But I feel like that's the way he thinks. If you can see a founder and that founder's vision, if you can see, a $500 billion deal or whatever amount it is, he believes it to be true. And I think that's like the visionary side of him that's coming out.
Yeah, I described this. It wasn't actually my analogy. It was somebody at SoftBank, but I thought it was very good describing the parallels between Masa's mindset and Ronald Reagan with Star Wars. And Reagan really believed Star Wars, and all the experts said, you can't have a space-based missile shield. It won't work. And Reagan refused to believe them. And in the same way, Masa, just believes he can see the future. And he's absolutely convinced. And if he thinks it's true, it must be true. That really describes him. And it is a bit like Reagan back in the mid-'80s on Star Wars.
So when we're in the startup world, like we tend to focus a lot on the founder and in some cases rightfully so. But in Masa's case, he also did have people around him that were able to execute on his vision, right? And so, in the 90s, I suppose Kitao-san would probably get a lot of the credit. And then maybe for Vision Fund, it was Misra, right? So, I mean, can you go into a bit more detail on those two figures and how they've influenced how Masa has been able to finance some of his endeavors?
I think Kitao-san, who now runs SBI, he was the finance director hired from Nomura in the mid-1990s, was an incredibly important figure because he essentially showed Masa how to take on the traditional banks and disrupt the bond market and redress the balance of power between lender and borrower. And this was really cunning. It was clever, and it was tough power play, very much in Kitao-san's image. And I think Masa owed him a lot. In the end, Kitao decided to move on, but his legacy is very important. There are other people who are important in more recent years. Marcelo Claure, who was the Bolivian American who ran Sprint for Masa, and Rajiv Misra in his own way. I know he's a very controversial figure in some respects. The Indian from Deutsche Bank, the trader, sometimes a little bit slippery, but a genius financial engineer. And he brought through others some of the connections in the Gulf to allow Masa to raise that huge amount of money for the SoftBank Vision Fund. But he also did the leveraged buyout, which allowed Masa to raise enough money to buy Vodafone Japan in 2006. It was the biggest leveraged buyout in Asia at the time. Nobody had seen it. And so this notion of what they call whole company securitization, this is all Rajiv Misra. And I think there were also one or two important fringe characters, not so well known, who were important in smoothing the path in America. So obviously Steve Jobs was critical he agreed to give Masa the exclusive rights to distribute the iPhone, which was a wonder product in 2008. You referred to that. But also
So
people
how
like...
did that happen, by the way, the Steve Jobs? I mean, how did he convince Steve Jobs?
Well, the way he tells it is that he had an inkling of what Steve Jobs was up to and produced a piece of paper. And I tell the story, in the book about Masa producing this piece of paper, and Steve Jobs says, I don't need your shitty piece of paper. I've got my own thing. And Masa says, oh, tell me, but I think I know. And what about this? And there's a sort of, they're playing footsie for a while, but Masa's persistence, and I think Steve Jobs' understanding that Masa is the disruptive force in the telecoms market. He's not the established NTT Docomo, which is at one point one of the most valuable companies in the world. He'd rather go with the disruptor. So I think Masa claims, he still very much claims quite a bit of credit. Not least designing the emojis for the iPhone. I think he probably did anticipate to a degree some of what Steve Jobs was up to. He's very clever in that respect, by the way. He's got an aesthetic component, and he also deeply does understand the technology.
On the topic of circles, how would you describe Masa and Trump's relationship and his standing in the US?
Well, there's a great passage which I describe how Masa first met Trump in Trump Tower just before the inauguration in November 2000, and I think it's December actually, 2016. He gets a meeting thanks to his connections. And by the way, he's got a great network of connections, Masa. You've got to give him credit for that. And it's Steve Schwarzman, the co-founder of Blackstone, but also this now deceased Las Vegas casino billionaire, Sheldon Adelson, big Republican donor, the biggest in 2016. They get him a meeting with Trump, and they say, keep it simple, just, make an offer to invest in the Trump economy. And Masa does that. He says $50 billion, 50,000 jobs. And within, a few minutes, Trump's enthusiastic. He's asking about tweeting it in real time. And then there's this hilarious scene, which I describe in the book, where Trump retreats to comb his hair and then looks at Masa and says, look, we're going to do this press conference. You need to get everything straight. And he starts showing him how to comb his hair. But the only difference is Masa's hardly got any hair. So it's hilarious. And a couple of people described this to me. But of course, he kept in touch. He invested through Foxconn, in the plant in Wisconsin. And also he had the Sprint investment. I don't know whether it was 50 billion. It depends how you add up the numbers. But now, of course, he's used his back channel. Sheldon Adelson's widow, Miriam, was also important to get another meeting with Trump in Mar-a-Lago, the winter retreat, in December last year. And then he's, literally the day after Inauguration Day, he's in the White House with Larry Ellison, the founder of Oracle, the software business, and Sam Altman of OpenAI, now worth $300 billion, that company, dollars. And Masa's in there. He's, as I say, he's the Forrest Gump of investing. He's there or thereabouts, always at the center or near the center of the action. So I think he has a good relationship with Trump. He realizes that flattering Trump's the best way, and offering him big numbers is even better.
I'm curious, what was the thing that was most surprising during your interactions with Masa and as you were writing this book?
I think the sensitivity that he displayed, particularly talking about his childhood. This was obviously painful for him, and he was very good in agreeing to let me meet his father, who was actually, we didn't know at the time, I didn't know, but was dying of cancer. He was 87. And I was allowed to go with my researcher, because I don't speak Japanese, to the family home in Kyushu, in Tosu, in Kyushu, to see that side of the family. And I think I was quite moved by the story. That surprise. And the other side of the coin would be some of the risk-taking took my breath away. And some of the trading that he was doing in 2020, 21, this was financial options trading off the charts. I understand investing, but he also likes playing the tables.
Right.
So that surprised me a bit too.
Well, Ronald, thank you so much. Again, immaculately written book. I think it's just out in English, right? Is there a Japanese version as well?
I'd love you to mention this because it's important that in a couple of weeks, the Japanese translation of Gambling Man will be in Tokyo, in Japan. And I'm hoping that lots of people will read it because it is the first Western biography of Masayoshi Son. There are Japanese biographies, but there's no Western biography as such. So I enjoyed doing it. It was a challenge. It was harder than I expected. But thank you so much for having me on the show.
Well, thank you for joining us.